Sade thought marrying a blind, abandoned mafia boss was the ultimate sacrifice for her family. But on her first night in the freezing corridors of the Choi estate, she discovered a terrifying truth. Her new husband wasn't just a prisoner of his blindness. He was a target. Someone in that house was systematically stealing his life, and they had no intention of letting his new African bride live long enough to stop them. Welcome back, family. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and redemption. Sade Williams' fingers brushed the textured crown of her hair, her reflection in the window showing a single, silent tear trailing down her warm brown skin. On the mahogany table before her lay a contract that felt heavier than lead. The paper was crisp and white, the kind used by men who own the world and the people in it. Across from her, her father's shoulders were hunched, his dignity stripped away by the debt he couldn't pay. "Baba, look at me," Sade's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Tell me you didn't sign my life away." Her father couldn't meet her eyes. He reached for a glass of water, his hand shaking so violently the ice rattled against the glass before it slipped, soaking the expensive contract. Neither of them reached for a towel. From the bedroom, the heavy, labored breathing of Sade's mother echoed through the small house, a reminder of the medical bills that had become a noose around their necks. 3 million rand, Sade whispered, her eyes burning as she stared at the figure. "You gambled our lives to the Choi syndicate." "They promised it was an investment, Sade," her father's voice cracked. "And then your mother's lungs, I was desperate." "So you sold me," Sade said, the words falling like stones in a deep well. "You traded your daughter's freedom for a chance to pay back a ghost." The man standing in the corner stepped into the light. Jinho looked more like a businessman than a monster, his smile sharp as a razor. "Not a ghost, Ms. Williams, a king, and you are going to be his eyes." The transition from the sweltering warmth of Durban to the clinical, biting chill of Seoul felt like stepping into another dimension. Sade stood at the iron-wrought gates of the Choi estate, her breath blooming in small white clouds before her. The house was a monolith of gray stone and glass, perched on a hill that seemed to look down on the rest of the world with silent judgment. She adjusted the collar of her modest dark dress, her fingers brushing the natural coils of her hair. She felt exposed, a single drop of ink on a vast, frozen canvas. The heavy doors groaned open, and a woman with eyes like chips of flint, Mrs. Choi, beckoned her inside without a word of welcome. The interior was silent, smelling of expensive floor wax and old secrets. Every step Sade took echoed against the marble, a rhythmic reminder that she was now property, a debt repaid in flesh and blood. "He is in the solar," Mrs. Choi said, her voice a dry rasp. "Do not expect gratitude. He did not ask for a wife, and he certainly did not ask for you." Sade kept her chin steady, her shoulders squared. She had survived the loss of her family's legacy and the slow heartbreak of her mother's illness. She would not be bowed by a house of ghosts. When she entered the solar, the light was dim, filtered through heavy velvet curtains that blocked the afternoon sun. At the far end of the room sat Choi Tiwoo. He was younger than she had imagined, but his presence was heavy, suffocating the air around him. He sat in a high-backed chair, dressed in a crisp white shirt that contrasted sharply with the dark glasses shielding his eyes. His jaw was set in a hard, uncompromising line. He didn't turn his head when she entered, yet his posture shifted, an animalistic awareness rippling through his frame. "You're late," he said. His voice was a low baritone, cold and serrated. "The flight was delayed," Sade replied, her voice soft but grounded. Tiwoo let out a sharp, mocking breath. "I can hear your heart, Ms. Williams. It's loud. Is it fear or the realization that you've traded the South African sun for a tomb?" He stood up then, and despite his blindness, he moved with a controlled, dangerous grace. He navigated the space with a precision that suggested he had memorized every inch of his confinement. He stopped just inches from her, so close she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something medicinal. Suddenly, his hand moved, not a strike, but a swift, possessive reaching out. His fingers brushed the air near her shoulder before his hand closed firmly around her upper arm. It wasn't a gesture of affection, it was a claim. His grip was a cage, a physical manifestation of the contract her father had signed. "Look at me all you want," he whispered, leaning down so his lips were ghosting near her ear. "Analyze the blind man, but remember this. In this house, I am the only one who cannot see your skin, and yet I am the only one who will truly know why you are here. You are a sacrifice, Sade. Don't expect me to make it easy for you to burn." Sade looked into the black void of his glasses, her own reflection small and distorted. He was a king abandoned by his people, hiding his wounds behind a mask of hostility. But as his hand tightened on her arm, she didn't flinch. She saw the tremor in his fingers, the vulnerability he tried so hard to crush. The war had begun, and she was the only one who knew the terrain. The silence of the Choi estate was not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary. It was the suffocating stillness of a tomb where everyone was holding their breath. In the 3 days since her arrival, Sade had become a ghost haunting the corridors of the mansion, observing the subtle cruelties that defined Tiwoo's existence. It began with the morning meal. She watched from the shadows of the hallway as a young maid placed a tray on the edge of Tiwoo's desk, far beyond the reach of his hand, and walked away without a word of guidance. Tiwoo's fingers brushed the empty air, searching for the steam of the coffee, his face a mask of cold indifference even as his knuckles whitened with frustration. Everywhere Sade looked, the neglect was intentional. The staff moved around him like he was an inanimate obstacle rather than a man, their eyes averted, their service performed with a jagged edge of contempt. They didn't just ignore his needs, they seemed to be erasing him. By the 4th morning, Sade's patience snapped. When the maid attempted to leave a lukewarm bowl of porridge on a side table 2 meters away from him, Sade intercepted her. She didn't speak Korean, but the fire in her eyes and the firm way she took the tray from the girl's hands required no translation. The maid scurried away, leaving Sade alone with the man in the dark glasses. "You're back," Tiwoo said, his voice like dry parchment. He didn't turn his head. "I told you there is nothing for you here but the smell of dust." Sade didn't answer. She walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the hardwood, and placed the tray directly in front of him. She took his hand. His skin was startlingly hot and guided his fingers until they touched the rim of the bowl. He flinched at the contact, his entire body tensing as if she had struck him, but he didn't pull away. "Eat," she said, her voice a low, melodious anchor in the sterile room. "You cannot fight a war on an empty stomach, Tiwoo." His hand suddenly flipped, his fingers locking around her wrist with that same terrifying, protective but possessive grip she had felt on her first day. He pulled her closer, forcing her to lean over his chair until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. Even through the dark lenses of his glasses, she felt the intensity of a gaze that shouldn't have been able to see her. "Why are you doing this?" he hissed. "Are you trying to make me dependent on you? Is that the play? If I trust the hands that feed me, I won't notice when they wrap around my throat." Sade didn't struggle against his hold. She stood her ground, her heartbeat steady against his pulse. "In my home, we do not let a lion starve just because he has lost his way in the tall grass. You are the master of this house, yet you let them treat you like a shadow. I was sold to be your wife, Tiwoo. I intend to be your eyes, whether you want them or not." His grip tightened for a heartbeat, his thumb pressing into the soft skin of her inner wrist as if trying to memorize her rhythm. There was a flicker of something, longing, perhaps, or a deep-seated fear, that crossed his features before he released her. He reached for the spoon, his movements jerky. Sade stayed by his side, a silent sentinel in the house of mirrors, realizing that his possessiveness wasn't born of power, but of a man drowning who had finally found something solid to cling to. The transition from being a guest to a guardian happened in the quiet, clinical moments of the afternoon. Sade had begun to memorize the rhythms of the house, specifically the clockwork arrival of the silver tray at 3 o'clock. It was always the same. A small porcelain cup of tea and 2 translucent capsules, delivered by a valet who never looked Tiwoo in the eye. Sade sat on the velvet chaise across from Tiwoo, watching him through the soft light of the solar. He reached for the pills with a practiced, stoic grace, but as soon as the medication met his tongue, the change was visceral. Within minutes, the man who moved with the precision of a predator began to fray at the edges. A fine, rhythmic tremor took hold of his hands, vibrating through his fingers until he had to tuck them beneath his thighs to hide the shaking. His breathing, usually deep and rhythmic, became shallow and jagged, and a beads of cold sweat broke out across his brow. Ti-woo, Sade's voice was a low threat of concern. It's the condition, he rasped, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance he couldn't see. The doctors say the nerves are collapsing. The vitamins are the only thing keeping the darkness from becoming permanent. Sade didn't believe it. She grew up in a world where you learned to read the body because you couldn't always afford a doctor. She knew the difference between a failing body and a body under siege. She stood up and walked toward him, her footsteps silent. She reached out, placing her hand over his, the one he was trying so desperately to keep still. The vibration was violent, a humming tension that felt like a wire about to snap. "They aren't helping you," she whispered, her intuition flaring like a signal fire. She picked up the empty porcelain cup, bringing it to her nose. Beneath the floral notes of the jasmine tea was a sharp, metallic tang, bitter and clinical, like the scent of a hospital basement. It was a smell that didn't belong in a garden. She remembered the way Jinho had looked at her in Durban. He hadn't looked like a man settling a debt. He had looked like a man disposing of a witness. "Who prescribes these?" Sade asked, her gaze sweeping the room, suddenly seeing the House of Mirrors for what it truly was, a laboratory of slow-motion murder. "My cousin's private physicians," Ti-woo replied, his jaw tight as he fought the tremors. "They are the best in Seoul. They have been treating me since the accident that took my sight." Sade leaned closer, her natural crown of hair shielding their conversation from any listening ears in the hallway. "Ti-woo, listen to me. I have spent my life watching things grow and watching things wither. A plant doesn't shake like this when it's being fed. It shakes when it's being poisoned." He stiffened, his possessive grip returning as he found her wrist in the dark, his fingers digging in with a desperate, terrified strength. For a moment, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped, revealing the abandoned boy underneath. "If you are wrong, Sade, I am a dead man. If you are right, I am already being buried alive." "Then we stop digging," she said, her voice like iron. She looked at the tray, her mind already racing toward a plan. She wasn't just his wife or his eyes anymore. She was his cure. The following morning, Sade made a silent vow. The vitamins would go down the drain, and the truth would be found in the quiet spaces between them. Without the chemical fog clouding his nervous system, Ti-woo was different, sharper, yet more fragile, like a nerve exposed to the air. He sat by the window where the morning sun provided a pale warmth, his hands resting on his knees. They were still, for the first time since she had arrived. Sade approached him, not with the hurried clinical pace of the staff, but with a deliberate rhythm. She didn't speak. She let the scent of her cocoa butter lotion and the soft rustle of her dress announce her presence. She stopped just within his reach, waiting. "The tremors," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "They haven't come today." "Because the poison is leaving you," Sade replied, her voice a soft anchor. Ti-woo reached out, his hand hovering in the empty space between them. Usually his movements were possessive, a grab for control in a world of shadows. But today, his fingers were questing, searching for something other than a captive. Sade didn't pull back. She took his hand and placed it against her cheek. His skin was cool now, the fever of the toxins breaking. His thumb traced the curve of her jaw, moving with a reverence that made her breath hitch. He traveled upward, his touch light as a feather, mapping the bridge of her nose, the arch of her brow, and the damp trail of a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. "You feel like a storm that has finally found the shore," he murmured. He moved his hand higher, his fingers tangling in the soft, springy coils of her hair. He explored the texture of her natural crown, his expression shifting from suspicion to wonder. To him, she was no longer just a contract or a voice from a distant land. She was becoming a landscape he could navigate by heart. Sade leaned into his palm, a silent surrender of her hyper-independence. For years, she had been the one everyone leaned on, the daughter, the provider, the sacrifice. But in the darkness of his world, she felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with sight. "What do you see, Ti-woo?" she asked softly. "I see a woman who was forced into a cage and decided to decorate it with fire," he said, his hand moving to the back of her neck, pulling her just an inch closer. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. He breathed in the scent of her, warm, earthy, and undeniably alive. I see someone I should have never been allowed to own. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. The protective but possessive grip was gone, replaced by a tentative, blossoming trust. He wasn't just a mafia boss, and she wasn't just a debt. They were two abandoned souls finding a common language in the silence. Tiwoo's hand slid down to her shoulder, anchoring her there, as if he feared that if he let go, the light she had brought into his darkened room would vanish with her. For the first time, Sade didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a partner. The stillness of the estate took on a different quality when the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sprawling mansion into a labyrinth of long shadows and creaking floorboards. With Tiwoo resting after their morning of shared trust, Sade found herself drawn to the eastern wing, a section of the house the servants avoided with a superstitious fervor. The air here was thicker, heavy with the scent of damp stone and forgotten time. Her fingers trailed along the wood-paneled walls until they snagged on a seam that didn't align with the rest. A gentle push revealed a door camouflaged by a heavy tapestry. It gave way with a reluctant groan, opening into a small, circular room that felt like a time capsule. This was a sanctuary, tucked away from the cold glass and steel of the modern Choi Empire. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, settling on a vanity mirror cracked like a spider web. In the center of the room sat a small lacquer chest, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Inside, Sade found a stack of leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed and fragile. As she opened the first one, the elegant, slanted handwriting of a woman named Minna, Tiwoo's mother, spilled out like a confession. Sade sat on the floor, the cold rising through the marble, as she read a history that mirrored her own. Minna hadn't been a mafia queen. She had been a scholar, married into the syndicate to bridge a gap between rival factions. The entries were a harrowing descent from hope into horror. She wrote of the slow-acting winter, her term for the toxins the family used to retire those who became too soft or too vocal. The most recent entries made Sade's blood run cold. Minna had seen the same betrayal forming around her son that was now suffocating Tiwoo. "They do not want a leader with a heart," one passage read. "They want a figurehead they can blink away. If Tiwoo learns to see the world as I do, Jinho will ensure he never sees at all." Sade realized then that Tiwoo's blindness wasn't just a tragic accident from his past. It was a calculated maneuver, a biological coup d'etat that had started years ago. The ghost of the estate wasn't a supernatural presence. It was the legacy of a mother who had tried to warn her son of the vipers at his table. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Sade snapped the journal shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't just an accountant's daughter or a forced bride anymore. She was the keeper of the Choi family's darkest secret. The journals proved that Jinho's cruelty wasn't just greed, it was a tradition. She tucked the smallest volume into the waistband of her dress, the weight of the paper feeling like a weapon. Looking at the cracked mirror, Sade saw a woman who no longer looked like a sacrifice. She looked like a revolutionary. She had come to this house to save her mother, but as she slipped back into the shadows of the hallway, she knew she wouldn't leave until she had finished the work Minna had started. She was going to tear the blindfold off this empire, one secret at a time. Sade returned to Tiwoo's room with the weight of the stolen journal pressing against her ribs like a second heart. The air in the solar felt thinner now, charged with the electricity of the secrets she carried. Tiwoo was sitting exactly where she had left him, but his head tilted toward her the moment she stepped through the door. His senses, sharpened by the absence of the toxins, were beginning to map the room with predatory precision. "You smell of dust and old paper," he said, his voice a low vibration in the dim light. "Where have you been, Sade?" Sade didn't lie. She couldn't afford to, not when their lives were already built on a foundation of sand. She walked to him and knelt by his chair, placing the leather-bound book on his lap. She took his hand and guided it to the embossed cover. "I found your mother's sanctuary, Tiwoo. I found her words. She wasn't just a ghost in this house. She was a witness. She knew what Jinho was doing long before the darkness took your eyes." Tiwoo's fingers trembled as they traced the indentations of the leather. For a long moment, the only sound was the jagged rhythm of his breathing. When he spoke, the mask of the cold mafia air had shattered, leaving behind a man who was acutely aware of the crosshairs painted on his back. I have known for a long time that I am being hunted, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Exile was supposed to be my safety, but it is just a slower way to die. They don't want a blind leader, Sade. They want a corpse that doesn't require a trial. Jinho doesn't just want the throne, he wants the bloodline erased. He turned his head toward her, the dark glasses reflecting the flickering candlelight. Why are you still here? You have the evidence now. You could use it to bargain for your freedom. You could run back to Durban and leave me to the winter. Sade reached up, her warm brown skin a stark contrast to the pale rigidity of his face. She took his hands in hers, squeezing them until he focused entirely on her presence. I didn't come here to be a witness to a murder, Tiwu. I came to save my family. But I've realized that my family isn't safe as long as Jinho holds the pen that writes the checks. We are tethered now. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. I will be your eyes. I will read the ledgers, I will watch the shadows, and I will taste your tea before it touches your lips. I will give you back the world they stole from you. And what is the price of this alliance? Tiwu asked, his grip tightening around hers, not in a cage, but in a desperate, grounding anchor. Protection, Sade said firmly. My mother's care must be ironclad. My father's debts must be more than just settled. They must be erased from the syndicate's memory. If I stay and fight this war with you, you must promise that no matter what happens to us in this house, my family remains untouched by the Choi name. Tiwu pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. You have my word, Sade Williams. If I fall, I will ensure they are safe. But if we win, I will give you more than just a paid debt. I will give you the keys to the kingdom they tried to bury us in. In the silence of the solar, an unholy alliance was sealed. They were no longer master and servant, or captor and bride. They were two rebels in a gilded prison, preparing to set the bars on fire. The following week brought a strange, fragile peace to the estate. With the tainted tea being replaced by Sade's own brews and the vitamins discarded, the fog in the solar seemed to lift. For the first time, the room didn't feel like a waiting room for the afterlife. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, a reminder of the monsoons that often visited Durban, and the shared isolation that had once felt like a cage was beginning to feel like a sanctuary. Sade sat on the floor by the large window, the rhythmic sound of the falling rain providing a natural percussion. Tiwu sat nearby, his head tilted, listening not just to the weather, but to the way Sade moved. He was leaning back, the tension in his jaw less pronounced than she had ever seen it. Tell me something about your home, he said suddenly. His voice was no longer a weapon, it was a request. Something that isn't about debts or syndicate contracts. Sade smiled, a genuine expression that didn't reach her eyes often in this house. We have a song, she said softly. My grandmother used to sing it when the storms were too loud. It's about a bird that flies against the wind until it finds the sun. It's called a lullaby, but it's actually a song about endurance. Without waiting for his response, she began to hum. The melody was low and earthy, filled with the soul of the KwaZulu-Natal coast. Then she let the words slip out in her native tongue, the soft, rhythmic clicks and deep vowels filling the sterile Korean room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the heating vents. Tiwu was motionless. As she sang, he reached out, his hand finding hers on the floor. He didn't grab it with his usual possessive intensity. Instead, he simply rested his palm against hers, skin to skin, anchor to anchor. Sade shifted her hand so their fingers interlaced, the forced nature of their union dissolving into something dangerously close to affection. The words, he whispered when she finished, what do they mean? They mean, the wings may be tired, but the sky is still yours, Sade translated, her voice thick with the memory of her mother. Tiwu pulled her hand up, pressing her knuckles against his lips. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability. He wasn't the blind Mafia boss in that moment, and she wasn't the black lady sold into a foreign empire. They were just two people who had been broken by the same system, finding a rhythm that belonged only to them. I have spent my life surrounded by people who speak my language, but tell me nothing but lies, Tiwu said, his forehead leaning against their joined hands. I don't understand your words, Sade, but I understand the fire in your voice. For the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm sitting in the dark. The spark between them was no longer just a shared secret or a strategic alliance. It was an intimacy that terrified Sade more than Jinho's threats. As the rain lashed against the glass, the marriage that had been signed in blood and desperation began to feel like the only real thing in a world of illusions. The cage was still there, but as Ti-woo pulled her closer, the bars didn't seem quite so cold. The fragile peace of the estate was shattered by the arrival of a sleek, black sedan that looked like a predator crouching on the gravel driveway. Jinho did not knock. He entered the solar with the arrogance of a man who already considered himself the master of the house. The air, which had recently been filled with the warmth of Sade's song, instantly turned frigid. Ti-woo stiffened in his chair, his hand reflexively tightening around Sade's fingers before he forced himself to let go, slipping back into the role of the abandoned, broken heir. Sade stood slowly, smoothing her dark dress, her natural hair framing a face that remained unreadable. "Ah, the African bride," Jinho said, his Korean smooth and condescending, though he spoke in English for her benefit. He walked a slow circle around her, his eyes scanning her from her sensible shoes to the steady gaze she leveled at him. "I see you've made yourself comfortable. The servants tell me you've been meddling in the kitchen, replacing the master's tea, playing nursemaid." "I am his wife," Sade replied, her voice low and resonant. "I am doing what is required of me." Jinho laughed, a sharp metallic sound that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped into her personal space, leaning down until he was inches from her face. "Let be clear about your requirements, Ms. Williams. You are not a wife. You are interest on a debt. You are a line item in a ledger that I happen to own." He reached out, his hand moving toward her hair as if to touch a curiosity, but Sade stepped back, not in fear, but with a deliberate, icy grace that made his hand hover in empty air. "You may own my father's debt, Mr. Choi," Sade said, her chin tilting upward, "but you do not own the woman standing in front of you. My dignity was not part of the contract." Jinho's smile faltered, replaced by a twitch of genuine malice. "Dignity is a luxury for those who can afford it. Your mother is currently breathing because I allow it. One phone call to Durban." And the machines stop. The specialized care vanishes. "Do you understand your place now?" He turned to Ti-woo, who sat in terrifyingly still silence. "And you, cousin, don't get too attached to your new pet. She's only here to make sure you stay quiet until the transition is complete. If she becomes a nuisance, I'll find a more permanent replacement." Sade felt the heat of fury rising in her chest, but she didn't lash out. She looked at Jinho, not with the terror he expected, but with a profound, quiet pity. "You think power is about who you can break," she said, her voice cutting through his bravado. "But you are so afraid of a blind man and a woman with nothing left to lose that you have to come here and bark like a dog to feel tall. You are the one who is truly abandoned, Jinho. You have no one in this house who loves you." Jinho's face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to retort, but the sheer weight of Sade's composure seemed to choke him. He adjusted his silk tie, his movements suddenly jerky. "Enjoy your little kingdom while it lasts," he spat, turning on his heel. As the roar of his engine faded into the distance, the room fell into a heavy silence. Sade felt a hand find hers. Ti-woo was reaching for her, his grip trembling but fierce. He pulled her down until she was kneeling beside him. "He will come for you now," Ti-woo whispered, his voice thick with dread. "Let him come," Sade replied, her eyes fixed on the door. "He thinks I am property. He's about to find out I am the storm." The following days were a blur of calculated risks and quiet deceptions. To the rest of the household, Sade appeared to be the dutiful, submissive bride, rarely leaving Ti-woo's side. In reality, she was a woman on a mission. Using the excuse of a shopping trip for traditional fabrics to decorate their room, Sade managed to slip away into the neon-lit backstreets of Seoul, far from the watchful eyes of the Choi syndicate's drivers. In her purse, she carried a small plastic vial containing the 2 translucent capsules she had intercepted before the valet could deliver them. She found the laboratory in a nondescript building, a private facility that asked no questions if the payment was made in cash. The technician, a man with tired eyes and a stained lab coat, had promised the results in 48 hours. Those 48 hours were the longest of Sade's life. She spent them watching Ti-woo, noticing how his hands remained steady now that she was secretly replacing his vitamins with simple herbal supplements. When she finally returned to the lab, the technician handed her a printed report with a grim expression. "This is not medicine," he said in broken English, pointing to the chemical breakdowns. "It is a neurotoxin, high concentrations of lead and a synthetic nerve-blocking agent. It is designed to cause chronic inflammation of the optic nerve and tremors in the extremities." Slowly, methodically. Sade felt the air leave her lungs. The slow-acting winter Minna had written about in her journals was real. She stared at the paper, her eyes blurring until she saw a specific note at the bottom. Nerve damage appears to be inhibitory rather than degenerative at this stage. Removal of the stimulus may allow for significant recovery of function. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Tiwoo wasn't permanently blind. He was being kept in the dark by a chemical veil that Jinho had been weaving for years. When she returned to the estate, she found Tiwoo in the library, his fingers tracing the braille of a book he had long ago given up on. Sade closed the door and locked it, a rare act of defiance against the household rules. She walked to him, her heart thundering so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Tiwoo," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and hope. She took his hands, pulling them away from the book. "I have the results. It's exactly what we feared, but it's better than we hoped." She placed the lab report against his chest, as if the truth could seep into him through the paper. "The blindness, it isn't permanent. The toxins are blocking the signals, not killing the nerves. You aren't broken, Tiwoo. You're just being suppressed." Tiwoo stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. He reached up, his fingers trembling as they touched the edge of his dark glasses. "You mean I could see again?" "Yes," Sade said, her warm brown skin flushing with the intensity of the moment. "If we keep the poison out of your system, the world will come back to you. Jinho didn't just steal your throne, he stole your light. But he didn't count on me." For the first time since she had arrived in Korea, Tiwoo didn't look like a defeated king. He looked like a man waking up from a nightmare. He pulled Sade into a fierce, desperate embrace, his head buried in the curve of her neck. The alliance was no longer just about survival. It was about a restoration that would shake the very foundations of the Choi Empire. The transition from the secluded silence of the estate to the blinding opulence of the Seoul Grand Ballroom felt like a descent into a den of wolves. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, French champagne, and the sharp, metallic tang of hidden agendas. This was the Winter Gala, the annual summit where the power players of the Choi Syndicate gathered to measure their influence in blood and gold. Sade stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand resting lightly on Tiwoo's arm. She was a vision of defiant grace in a floor-length dark dress that clung to her curves like a second skin, her warm brown skin glowing against the deep silk. Her natural hair, styled into a soft, regal crown, framed a face that was elegant and expressive, hiding the storm of nerves brewing beneath her steady gaze. Beside her, Tiwoo was a portrait of iron-willed composure. He wore his dark glasses like a shield, his chin tilted at an angle that suggested he was looking down on the crowd, even if his world was currently a canvas of shifting shadows. As they descended, the room fell into a jagged, expectant silence. Every eye, cold, judgmental, and curious, was fixed on the black swan and her fallen king. Sade felt the weight of their prejudice like a physical pressure, but she didn't falter. She leaned closer to Tiwoo, her voice a low, secret melody in his ear. "Left 3 paces. The patriarch of the Kang family is starring. Keep your head high, Tiwoo. You are the only true royalty in this room." Tiwoo's grip on her arm tightened, not the desperate hold of a drowning man, but the steadying anchor of a partner. They moved through the crowd with a synchronized elegance that whispered of a bond the syndicate couldn't quantify. Then the sea of silk and tuxedos parted to reveal Jinho. He stood in the center of the room, a glass of amber liquid in his hand and a predatory smirk on his face. He had orchestrated this evening to be Tiwoo's public funeral, a demonstration of the heir's incompetence and Sade's perceived status as a mere trinket. "Cousin," Jinho's voice boomed, cutting through the low hum of the orchestra. How wonderful of you to join us. I was just telling the board how difficult it must be for you to navigate even the simplest of tasks these days. He turned his gaze to Sade, his eyes raking over her with calculated disrespect. And your lovely acquisition. Tell me, does she speak, or is she merely here for the contrast? The crowd chuckled, a dry, cruel sound. Sade felt Tiwoo's muscles coil, a low growl of a response forming in his chest, but she beat him to it. She stepped forward, her shoulders straight and her gaze locking onto Jinho's with a ferocity that silenced the room. I speak quite clearly, Mr. Choi, Sade said, her voice resonant and unshakable. And what I see in this room is a collection of men obsessed with the past, while the future is standing right in front of them. My husband may not see your face, but he sees your fear. It's written in every desperate word you speak to prove you are relevant. Jinho's face flushed a deep, ugly purple. He hadn't expected the property to have a blade for a tongue. He opened his mouth to retaliate, to use the threat of her family as a leash, but the sheer dignity in Sade's expression stopped him cold. She stood by Tiwoo, a pillar of fire in a room of ice, letting the syndicate know that if they wanted to take the king, they would have to go through the queen first. The victory at the gala had been a hollow one, a flicker of light before a deliberate, crushing dark. The atmosphere in the estate shifted overnight, turning from a sanctuary of burgeoning trust into a courtroom of unspoken accusations. Sade felt at the moment she entered the study, a coldness that didn't come from the winter air, but from the man sitting behind the desk. Tiwoo was holding a burner phone and a stack of financial printouts that hadn't been there the night before. His dark glasses were back on, a wall of glass between them. When he spoke, his voice was a jagged rasp, stripped of the warmth they had cultivated in the quiet afternoons. I was beginning to believe in miracles, Sade, he said, his fingers trembling as they gripped the edge of the desk. I was beginning to think you were the only soul in this world who didn't have a price, but it seems my cousin's pockets are deeper than your loyalty. Sade stopped in the center of the room, her heart beginning a slow, agonizing thud. Tiwoo, what are you talking about? He threw the phone across the desk. It skittered to a stop near her hand. The encrypted messages, Sade. The bank transfers to an offshore account in Durban, dated 2 days ago, the same day you went to the market. You've been feeding Jinho my medical records. You've been telling him exactly how much of the poison is left in my system. Sade picked up the phone, her eyes scanning the fabricated logs. It was a masterclass in deception. The messages were written in her voice, using her South African slang, detailing Tiwoo's recovery as a tactical weakness. This isn't me, she whispered, her voice thick with the horror of the frame-up. Tiwoo, look at me, you know me. This is Jinho's work. He's trying to isolate you again. But the seed of abandonment, planted deep in Tiwoo's childhood when his own family cast him into the dark, had finally sprouted. The trauma of being a discarded king overrode the logic of the heart. He stood up, knocking his chair back with a violent crash. I gave you the keys to my life, he roared, his face contorted with a grief that looked like rage. I trusted the hands that touched my face. Were you laughing while you sang those songs to me? Were you calculating the interest on my soul? Tiwoo, please. Sade stepped toward him, reaching for his hand, but he flinched back as if her touch were acid. Don't, he hissed. The contract is over. I will honor the debt for your mother's sake, because unlike you, I have a shred of honor left. But I cannot have a spy in my bed. I cannot have a traitor as my eyes. He pointed toward the door, his hand shaking with the force of his betrayal. Get out, Sade. Take your dignity and go back to the sun. I would rather die in the dark alone than live in a light provided by a liar. Sade stood frozen, the single tear she had been holding back finally breaking and tracing a path down her warm brown skin. She looked at the man she had begun to love, seeing only the jagged remains of a soul that had been broken too many times to recognize the truth. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the room, her shoulders straight even as her world crumbled, leaving the blind king in a prison of his own making. The transition from the icy, high-tech corridors of Seoul to the humid, salt-heavy air of Durban felt less like a homecoming and more like a retreat into a fatting dream. Sade stepped off the plane with nothing but a single suitcase and a heart that felt as though it had been hollowed out by a sculptor's chisel. The vibrant colors of the South African coast, the deep greens of the sugar-cane fields and the bruised purples of the Indian Ocean at dusk, seemed muted, as if she were viewing her old life through a veil of mourning. She returned to the small house that had once felt like a cage, only to find it was now a fortress of quiet desperation. Her father, broken by the weight of his shame, could barely look at her, but Sade had no time for his guilt. She moved with a clinical, focused energy, using the remainder of the funds Tiwoo had released to ensure her mother's specialized care continued. She spent her days in the sterile hum of the hospital ward, holding her mother's hand and watching the steady rise and fall of the ventilator, a rhythm that cost a fortune in blood and dignity to maintain. Despite the distance of thousands of miles, the shadow of the Choi syndicate followed her. It started as a prickle at the back of her neck in the hospital parking lot. Then, it became the sight of the same silver sedan parked at the end of her street, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh African sun like the blind eyes of a predator. She was no longer in the house of mirrors, but the mirrors had followed her home. Sade's hyper-independence, once her greatest strength, now felt like a lead weight. She told no one of the men in suits who lingered at the edge of the market, or the way her phone would click with a metallic echo whenever she made a call. She was a woman in a crossfire, waiting for a bullet she couldn't see. In the quiet hours of the night, when the only sound was the distant crashing of the waves against the shore, Sade would sit on her porch and touch the textures of her hair, the soft crown Tiwoo had once marveled at. She remembered the scent of sandalwood and the way his forehead had felt against hers. Heartbreak was a physical ache, a constant pressure in her chest that made every breath a struggle. She had been framed for a crime she didn't commit and exiled by the man she had tried to save. She knew Jinho wouldn't let her live forever. She knew too much about the slow-acting winter and the journals of a dead queen. She was a loose end in a world that preferred knots tied in blood. But as she watched the silver sedan pull away from the curb for the third time that week, Sade felt a flicker of the old fire. She had survived the Korean Mafia's palace. She would not be taken in the streets of her own city. If she was going to die, she would die standing straight, with her chin up, reminding the shadows that they could never truly own the sun. The humidity of the Durban afternoon felt heavy, like a held breath, as Sade walked back from the hospital. The silver sedan was no longer idling at the corner. It had been replaced by two nondescript SUVs parked directly in front of her family's gate. Her pulse spiked, a cold dread washing over her. She didn't turn back. She didn't run. She walked toward the danger with the steady, rhythmic gait of a woman who had already faced the dark and survived. As she reached the gate, the doors of the SUVs swung open simultaneously. 4 men stepped out, professionals, their suits out of place against the vibrant, dusty street. They didn't move like neighbors. They moved like the slow-acting winter Jinho had threatened. One of them reached into his jacket, his eyes fixed on Sade with a clinical lack of emotion. "Ms. Williams," the lead man said, his voice a low rasp, "your contract has been terminated, permanently." Sade closed her eyes for a heartbeat, picturing her mother's steady breathing and the journals of Minna. She braced herself for the end, her chin tilted high. But the sound that followed wasn't a gunshot. It was the screech of tires and the roar of a high-performance engine. A black car tore around the corner, fishtailing into the dirt and skidding to a halt between Sade and the hitman. The driver's door flew open. A man stepped out, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that Sade recognized in her very soul. He wasn't wearing dark glasses. His eyes, though squinting against the harsh, unforgiving African sun, were open. They were bloodshot and watery, clearly struggling with the glare, but they were fixed, with absolute murderous intent on the men in suits. "Tiwoo," Sade's voice was a broken whisper. He didn't look at her, not yet. He drew a weapon from his waistband with the practiced ease of the king he was born to be. "Get behind the car, Sade," he commanded. His voice wasn't the jagged rasp of a broken man. It was the thunder of a predator reclaimed. The hitmen hesitated, the sight of the air they thought was blind, and dying now standing before them as an executioner freezing their blood. "The master said you were a ghost, Tiwoo," the leader stammered. "The master was wrong," Tiwoo replied. He fired a single, warning shot into the pavement at their feet, the crack echoing like a whip through the quiet suburb. "Tell Jinho that the winter is over. Tell him I can see exactly where his heart is." The men scrambled back into their vehicles, the fear of the Choi name, and the man who now bore it with sight, overwhelming their orders. As the SUVs sped away in a cloud of dust, the silence returned, heavier than before. Tiwoo lowered his weapon, his chest heaving. He turned to Sade, his eyes blinking rapidly against the light. He reached out, his hand trembling as it found her cheek. This time, he didn't need to map her face with his fingers to know she was there. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the warm brown of her skin and the strength in her gaze for the first time with his own eyes. "I saw the messages, Sade," he choked out, his voice thick with 1,000 apologies. "I saw the deep fakes, I saw everything. I am so sorry I let the dark tell me who you were." Sade leaned into his touch, her hand covering his. The African sun beat down on them, blinding and beautiful, as the man who had been her prisoner became her savior, and the woman who had been a sacrifice became his light. The return to Seoul was not a homecoming, but an exorcism. The winter air still bit at the glass of the Choi estate, but the shadows that had once ruled the hallways were retreating. Tiwoo moved through the compound with a terrifying, newfound clarity. His vision was still a fractured mosaic of light and color, but he no longer needed eyes to see the rot that had consumed his family's legacy. With Sade at his side, her hand a steadying warmth against his arm, he walked into the grand council chamber where Jinho sat, already measuring the crown for his own head. The confrontation was swift and bloodless, executed with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent years learning the secrets of his enemies in the dark. Sade stood as his witness as Tiwoo laid out the evidence, the medical records, the journals of his mother, and the financial trail of the toxins. He didn't ask for the throne, he dismantled it. By the time the sun set over the Han River, the Choi Syndicate was a ghost of the past, its assets liquidated into a legitimate foundation, and its lethal traditions buried under the weight of the law. Jinho was left with nothing but the echoes of his own greed, a man abandoned by the very power he had tried to steal. Weeks later, the biting chill of Korea was a world away, replaced by the golden, honeyed light of the Durban coast. The Indian Ocean roared with a welcoming thunder as Sade stood on the veranda of a house that belonged to no one but them. There were no cameras here, no spies in the kitchen, and no vitamins on a silver tray. Inside, the sound of her mother's laughter, weak but real, drifted through the open windows, a miracle funded not by a debt of blood, but by a future built on choice. Her father sat in the garden, his shoulders finally beginning to uncoil from the years of shame. Tiwoo walked out to join her, his steps confident on the wooden deck. He had traded his silk suits for linen, his dark glasses for a gaze that was soft and present. He stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her in a way that was finally, truly protective without the edge of possession. He leaned down, his forehead resting against the soft crown of her hair, breathing in the scent of sea salt and cocoa butter. "Do you regret it?" Sade asked softly, her fingers interlaced with his. "Giving up the empire, the power." Tiwoo turned her in his arms, his eyes, partially recovered but brilliant with life, searching hers. "I traded a kingdom of shadows for a single moment in the sun with you, Sade. That isn't a sacrifice, that's salvation." The black lady who had been sold as a sacrifice looked out at the horizon, a single tear of joy finally replacing the grief of the past. The contract was gone. The debt was paid. As the sun dipped below the waves, turning the world into a canvas of fire and gold, they stood together, not as two souls forced into a cage, but as two partners who had chosen to fly. The story that began with a tear of fear ended with a smile of freedom, written in the sand and washed clean by the tide. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to see more videos like this. Comment the city you are watching from. See you in our next video.